So about 6 months ago, like today is a little opportunity or a mini reflection for you to come and get some time out. About 6 months ago, Justine and I took a bit of time out as we were really forming Spring Point to get a bit of, some personal space and reflection on the work that we had been doing, the work that we wanted to do over the coming 5 or 10 years and what was going to be really important about that. So we took some time to go to the States and I went East Coast. I always have to do my never eat soggy Weet-Bix to try and remember where East and West is. So I was East Coast and Justine was West Coast. And we went over there with the same broad intent, which was to think about what better practice, best practice, what next practice might look like in the field of strategy, culture, leadership and learning, and more broadly, how to create real and meaningful change and how to have impact. So that was our general thinking. But when we came back, it was really interesting. We actually met after our two little trips. Justine was West Coast, I was East Coast. We came back to LA and we spent a little bit of time there. And as we started to share what we'd heard, I was over at a conference just out of Boston, and I was working with a guy who's big in systems change and all that sort of stuff, which we'll share a little bit more about later.
I was hanging out with Barack Obama.
You were with Barack Obama. Sounds a little bit more high end, doesn't it? Well, I haven't mentioned names yet, but we came back, and as we were sort of sharing our stories, we found there was a really interesting coalescence of the same type of themes, which is really what brought us to start to develop today about 6 months ago. And so the question that we came up with really underscores the topic of today, and it was really, in developing culture and capability change at scale, how do you have impact and what works? That was really our key question. And we really started seeing these big themes emerge in the conversations we've been having. We're talking to some people who've been practicing for 30 or 40 years, some researchers, academics, and practitioners. So how we're going to run this is I'm going to hand to Justine in a moment. But the framing question that I saw from working with Peter Senge in Boston was, it's done a double click. My little quote's gone.
Go again.
Oh.
One more.
Oh, there it is. So the framing statement that Peter Senge, who I spent 4 days with in Boston, was this one on the left-hand side, and that is that the leadership issue of our time is how we can productively confront complex issues where hierarchical authority is inadequate to bring about change. These challenges require a unique mix of leaders in different positions who lead in different ways. The two things within that which we centred a number of days on was firstly this concept of hierarchy, and it's something that has worked for us in the past but isn't working for us currently, or we need to find new ways to work with it and within it to create meaningful and systemic organisational change and change within the broader community and customer groups that we work with. So that's the first point in there. The second one is that there are points within organisations where more change happens or we can focus differentially to create scaled impact. And those 3 points are referred to at a high level in that last sentence. They're a unique mix of leaders. So we're going to talk a bit today about who are they and how do we intersect and interact with them and even invest in them to create scaled change. So I did skip over our previous slide, which was really describing something about what is scale and what do we mean by that. So scale implies touching a critical mass of leaders and employees to reach a tipping point, after which point the change becomes self-sustaining. So for us in there, you can see it's about impact, which describes meaningful change over a significant group of people within an organisation or group. So that's really the focus for us today. Without too much further ado from me, I'm going to hand to Justine to start to share a little bit about her Hollywood experience.
I'm so glad you didn't tell the story about my poor directions and hike trail selection to the Hollywood sign. I think a short hike to the Hollywood sign ended up being over 3 hours due to my spatial reasoning. And on top of that, because the coffee's hard to get in the States, it's delicious, or, gives you that Melbourne fix. And so Dylan had managed to find a cafe that served great coffee, and it meant that I had about 4 shots before this hike because we're actually we're getting the right blend of milk and coffee. So Dylan always suggests that our debrief was actually probably a lot of me doing a lot of talking over 3 hours, and then we didn't get that view of the Hollywood sign. Our hike ended up behind the Hollywood sign, looking down. So yeah, I've now dobbed myself in, but I haven't lived that one.
You have told that story. You have told that story now, but yeah, it was a fascinating hike. But the challenge with it is I've got really dodgy knees, and so when Justine said, yeah, let's go over there, I said, that looks like a long way away. That looks really far. And she said, no, it's just over there. You can just see it. But there was obviously a lot happening between that tip of the mountain and the next tip of the mountain. So about 2 hours later, I had to sit down, and Justine's like, oh, you're okay. So it was difficult. But we had a lot of the conversations, and that was the point where we sort of shared some of these stories that we're about to share with you.
Yeah, thank you. So pass of the baton, it feels like. So I guess while Dylan was on the East Coast with Peter Singh, I was attending ATD, where Obama was the keynote, and definitely a highlight. 14,000 people to this conference. There was over 300 sessions packed in a few days, and one of my next highlights was actually Jack Zenger's presentation on mass producing extraordinary leaders. And I don't know if you follow Zenger and Folkman or have heard of them as a leadership development consultancy in the States. They're really well regarded, really heavy research base under their work. And the interesting thing about Jack is that he's 87 years old and one of the most vital 87-year-olds I think I've ever come across. And I sat pretty much spellbound in his presentation, and he was reflecting. We've got this theme of reflection throughout our session today, and he was reflecting on over 50 years in leadership development. So I'm not sure how many other still practicing practitioners, can sort of talk to that amount of time. And the conclusion, one of his key conclusions after 50 years of practicing leadership development, is that he didn't believe we've done a good enough job within organisations of practicing what he describes as herd immunity. We're not reaching enough leaders. We're not inoculating enough leaders in terms of great leadership, so that any outliers are almost given a level of protection, just like how we work with immunisations. So he was saying we need to reach more. We've biased sort of favouring quality over quantity and high touch. And this line here about special things for a special few, that's been how we've approached leadership development. We've thought about sort of this, these heroes in the high up echelons of organisations and focused on them. And he feels that for real impact, we must reach a critical mass. So we sort of had this coalescing of ideas around scale and critical mass and how you might achieve that. And so what we want to talk through now is just some of what we started furiously researching and looking at when we got back to Melbourne. So I guess what I've sort of put here is that through those quotes and through just even the concepts that we deal with daily in our work, we're seeing this real interweaving of themes of leadership, culture, capability, change, performance. They all sort of bubble up in the same conversations. And that includes our work that we do with the Denison, which is a really systemic view of culture and leadership effectiveness. There's two sets of tools. And what these are showing are, sort of don't need to, I'll sort of share the punchline rather than sort of all the detail of these slides. But what you're looking at in the first set of circumplexes is really trying to highlight the correlation between leadership effectiveness with higher culture scores. So those organisations with the sort of bottom quartile or culture scores, the bottom 10, their leadership profile is, I guess in this particular case, more colour is good. So more colour suggests higher scores. So lower performing organisations from a cultural viewpoint also tend to have lower levels of leadership effectiveness. And the opposite is true for those who have higher culture scores, which would suggest higher performing organisations. Their leaders are demonstrating much more leadership effectiveness. And then the second link that we're seeing is that higher culture scores, particularly when you're using a performance-oriented tool like the Denison, are highlighting that higher culture scores actually translate to better value creation and return. So things like EBITDA and sales growth. So some of these core metrics are really being sort of demonstrated as higher end when you're starting to get these really strong, positive, constructive, high-performing cultures. So we sort of knew that, just from anecdotally that these concepts keep coming up in our work, and we were sort of starting to work with tools that were really showing the link as well. But then we started to kind of look at the research and the data, and this is actually really recent research. McKinsey published a book that I've got on pre-order. Hopefully it gets delivered today or tomorrow. So it was only released on Monday, and they're talking about leadership at scale as well. So we were sort of quite reassured that we felt a little bit on the same track as some preeminent thinkers in this space. And some of the data they're showing is that organisations with top quartile leadership effectiveness average a 3.5 time greater total return to shareholders than organisations with bottom quartile scores. And that's over a 3-year period. So the data is still pushing or suggesting this trend over time. So sustainable impact has always been really important to us in how we've thought about this. Also, the organisations that invest in developing leaders during significant transformations are 2.4 times more likely to hit the goals of that transformation. So that's sort of a really great stat to be thinking about as well. And then this one as well, that leadership strength explains nearly 80% of the variance in organisations' ability to sustain exceptional performance over time. So that all the data is pointing to that, leaders are really important, and their capability and commitment during change and how that translates to sort of the culture that gets played out is really important. But, so there's always a but when you sort of start with a big front end like that. Even after spending $50 billion annually on developing their leaders, only 14% of CEOs worldwide believe that they have the leadership talent necessary to actually execute or deliver on that business strategy, which would include those transformation goals. So clearly, that is not a good return on investment, if that's kind of the outcome of all of that dollars spent in terms of leadership development. And so I guess that Dylan and I have sort of been musing over things, sort of stats like that and research like that, and I guess a sub-question, because we painted a question that's kind of the overarching question for today. But a sub-question is, well, what if it's not only how we develop leaders that we need to reconsider, but who and how much we invest as well? So it's sort of a sub-question that we started looking at a little more closely. And so more numbers in terms of, I guess, sort of really pulling that apart a little bit. But this stat was from a Harvard Business School study from a year or two ago, and their study segmented participants in that study and identified organisations that were considered best in class from both a leadership effectiveness perspective and performance. And they found that those organisations considered best in class also focused, 90% of those organisations that were considered best in class focused equally on leadership development from senior leaders right through to emerging leaders. So that seems like a strong correlation between this leadership at scale or leadership at all levels and the impact that can have from a performance perspective. The second stat we've included because we think this highlights a kind of knowing-doing gap that we grapple with in organisations all the time. So this was a Brandon Hall study, a sort of preeminent research and analysis firm, and they found that a full 83% of participating organisations in their study said it was important to develop leaders at all levels, but only 5% actually do so. So there's this growing sort of awareness that we can't just invest in the top. It's not just the sort of high-end, sort of really amazing offsites or sort of flying, our top leaders and high potentials to sort of exotic places for deep immersion offsites. It's how do we actually reach a tipping point by addressing leadership at all levels. The last stat, just to continue to build this case, I included this mainly because it was really relevant data from an Australian perspective. This is from the Centre of Workplace Leadership that's operating out of Melbourne Uni at the moment. But their evidence, and this is just from a couple of years ago, was that for the Asia-Pac region, including Australia, so quite local data, it shows that for every $10 spent on senior leaders, only $1 is spent on frontline leaders, which is really interesting when you consider proportionally and cohort size-wise the differential in those two groups. So I guess what that's all led us to sort of put to you today for us to consider a little more in the presentation we've got here, but then more in your groups in a moment, is this realisation that we don't think traditional top-down culture change efforts, this idea that, well, if the CEO is on board, we can't start. We're sort of feeling that these top-down change efforts need to be flipped on the head, or the feeling like it can only happen from the top. and that a new investment plan, so how we invest, where we focus, it needs to recognise the active role and differential impact, which is a phrase Dylan's already used, that different leaders have on sustaining and creating organisational change. So that's led us to kind of put some thinking down that we'd like to share with you now in terms of what we think that investment plan needs to look like. If that's a little tricky to read on screen, you might be sitting on it still, but there is a handout that you can look off in terms of this one that has a little bit of the information we're going to run through now summarised. But I guess in terms of this idea of differential impact, it's not to say that by sort of looking at this different investment bias that was suggested, that the roles of executive leaders, for example, aren't important. We think it's just really important to start considering the different roles and the complementary roles that different leadership cohorts play within a change effort. So just from a summary perspective, I guess it's highlighting that our executive leaders, those top leaders, they really create they've got a stewardship and sponsorship role and are imperative to creating the enabling environment for change to occur. But potentially controversially, we don't believe they're the change makers per se. They're not sort of out on the front lines. They're not deep within the organisation, sort of implementing changes then and there. But their priorities, their decisions, their actions can either sort of obstruct or facilitate change. And it sets the overall tone for transformation or change, or the lack of, within an organisation. So it's more of that enabling, it's more the environment that they create that we think is important. The second sort of segment that we wanted to discuss, and it was hard to find stats on this, and the reason it's hard to find stats on this is they're typically described as hidden or invisible leaders within an organisation. And these are your network influencers or your network leaders who may not have formal leadership positions, but to use a quote that, or a definition that Dylan shared with me, that Peter shared in their workshop, but a really nice definition of leaders are those who walk ahead. And so these are actually leaders within the organisation, often in formal roles, that are really connected. They're often seen as role models because the way that they're actually getting work done and the way that they're influencing without authority. And to not consider these individuals as leaders within your organisation, Peter suggests, is to actually overlook a significant change lever within your organisation. And I guess the benefit nowadays is that we have tools like social networking analysis and other ways to kind of raise these leaders, let them bubble up to the surface and really engage them strongly. And then the last one, frontline leaders. So they're often also overlooked, and it's often because the barriers to developing frontline leaders can often be considered significant. Frontline leaders in some organisations, depending on structure, will actually sort of be accountable for up to 80% of the rest of the workforce. So they're often well distributed. If there's geographical spend, there's time. You don't always get immediate impact like having this amazing program that's delivered for a small cohort quickly. We haven't always had the digital technology to really create blended learning solutions. We've had to rely on face-to-face. So there's lots of reasons why these are not always sort of invested in, but believe that they're absolutely critical to change because they're closest to the customer, and customer centricity is such a key factor of strategy at the moment. They're the ones closest to the front lines, hence the name, where value is getting created. So very, very important. And so I guess based on that, just to show in a little bit more detail, a lot of this is what I've covered, but really to highlight that it's this sort of rationale that's led us to suggest that instead of almost exclusively focusing on our executive leaders, it's probably more around that sort of 20%, of your investment focus, which potentially translates to spend, because they're not necessarily the change makers. So it's reducing the investment potentially there to surface, or to make sure that you're also investing in network leaders, those that can actually really spark change, connect people who are testing and learning in different parts of the organisation, helping them come together so the change can stick and grow and not remain in sort of pockets. And then frontline leaders.
Yeah, I mean, that network leaders one's a really interesting one. I'm sure many of you have perhaps seen, maybe even been involved in this sort of concept of social network analysis and the outcomes of that. It's something that's been emerging for the last 10 years. But I think the really interesting thing that Sengi talked about, particularly to this concept of scale, is he's saying, well, we often can make change within functions. And we can put some really good effort into that, but we don't see it carry across. We might see competition within an organisation or silos, and it can be really hard to compete against that. So it's essentially saying, actually, there are people without formal roles or formal leadership roles who can take ideas across, and it's actually the absence of a formal role that allows them to move easily and use their influence to actually carry ideas. So it's still, I think, for years, decades, we've been doing stakeholder analysis as a part of change, good change management. So that's not new. But I think there's obviously emerging technology and diagnostics to help identify who these people are more. But the basic idea is that we can proliferate ideas if we think about those who can have impact and influence.
So I think I've covered a lot of when I was talking to the earlier slide around some of this detail, and we'll make all these slides available sort of post the session today. But I guess these last sort of slides, and they're essentially summarised with a few practical strategies on that handout. I guess we were wanting to kind of present this rationale and describe these cohorts, because the next sort of section that we're going to move towards is actually, well, it's all very well and good to identify these cohorts and almost name an investment focus or try to actually sort of wrap some figures around that. But then what do you do to engage them, and what are some perhaps design principles or guiding principles about the way that you would do that? So do you want me to hand the baton again?
Perhaps I know Justine done a great job of describing some of the research and evidence that sits behind this. I think we've described the fact that we were lucky enough to be able to engage with some people who've seen a lot, and perhaps a lot more than us. But in the last 6 months, we've also done a number of things to try and engage with a large number of our clients on some conversations centred just around this. And we've found very similar ideas. So many of you are probably sitting there going, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So in some ways, we're hopefully formalising some things or some hunches that you've had, and perhaps helping you bring a bit more of a stronger evidence base and a point of view that you can present organisationally. So I think where I'm going to go now is really thinking about what are the things that are either not at the scene of the crime when we see scaled change not work, or we see organisational change efforts fail, or we see the success factors that are always part of work that works. And we're talking here not just around capability work. I think we're talking about culture work, and I think we're talking about change work. We're talking about work that's generally focused on creating behavioural change. So we don't necessarily need to bucket it into any one of those types of interventions. So we've called them the design imperatives to generate learning and change. And some of the language that goes around in the research in this, they talk about growth processes. That sounds a little bit overdone. But we're saying, what are the design elements that must be there? So there are three of them. And the first, second, and third are listed there. And I think I'm going to talk through each of them. But I guess it's the coming together of them that is actually really important. So the first one is about the capabilities to dialogue. So how do we go about creating change? You can't actually see the text underneath there. I can see it up here, but it says build the capabilities for change or for dialogue because conversations create change. There's a really great quote down there. It says the conscious acts of creating space, of engaging people in genuine questions, and of convening around a clear intention with no hidden agenda creates a very different type of energy from that which arises from seeking to get people committed to your plan. So really what we're talking about is how in any of those efforts do we make sure we create the skills of leaders to firstly see themselves as part of the system, as part of the problem, and to be able to recognise that they're not just acting on something or directing something to happen. They have to step into that conversation. And I guess fundamental to this first principle is the need to be able to build trust to be able to change groups, to change functions, to change organisations. So building trust, which requires a level of emotional connection. So many of you will be familiar with the types of ways that can happen in learning practice or in embedding change in organisations. At the right-hand side, in practice, it means reflective practice. So this is not a new concept. This is an old concept, but research, even really recent research from McKinsey, shows that there's up to a 20% improvement in performance when groups just take the time each day, 15 minutes, to reflect. So some simple things that sometimes can get lost, but are always there in organisations that learn and change over time. Advocacy and inquiry, the ability to ask questions and the ability to share a view in a way that doesn't alienate other people within groups. Really important skills of leaders to be able to create change. Deep listening to understand what's really going on within groups. Facilitation, the ability to be able to process, facilitate and involve a group in dialogue. Coaching, which we know a lot about, and a lot of great work has been done over the last 10 years in particular, and giving and receiving feedback. So there's some of the practices or skills, but essentially saying we need to equip leaders to be able to have conversations. Yep, structure creates change, process creates change, all of those things do help create change, but conversations are critical and are at the heart of this work. So the second key ingredient here is enabling learning networks. So our little statement under there is that commitments is generated when teams, communities and groups learn together. So what we probably know intuitively, but perhaps can sometimes forget, is that learning, both when you think about it practically and when you go back to the roots of adult learning theory or social learning theory, it's a social process. We learn from others and with others. That is where learning is most powerful. And actually, we're in an age now where there's the opportunity to really leverage the technology we have to hyper-accelerate this particular principle. So it's a really interesting one. The quote down there from The Dawn of System Leadership, the missing elements of learning and change interventions is often a clear vision for how the work itself becomes developmental. And this is something I think we've grappled with for a long time. If we think about classroom learning, we go, how does the work itself become developmental? I think that's a really big challenge in learning design and change design. This means employing models of change that weave together outcome, process, and human development. So, in practice, we're seeing great work happen in this space. Agile, lean, and design thinking methodologies are all about work that has strong reflective practice. It's embedded, there's process around how you go about engaging with people and teams that help groups focus on a problem, test, have a go, come back, reflect, learn, and keep moving on. So they're the core practices, and we're seeing that emerge in organisations now, which is terrific. Team coaches is something that we've seen happen a lot, which is, instead of embedding work or people into, instead of embedding, actually, I'll just read from here, injecting development, feedback, and accountability into the work, not the other way around. That was the bit I meant to say. So, how do we help bring a level of capability building into work rather than trying to manufacture it outside? Leadership development programs where we tack on particular projects outside which don't really have real accountability sitting next to them. So we've definitely seen the use of team coaches who sit in with executive teams and help them reflect in the moment and build skill while they're talking about the issues that matter, whether it's around governance, whether it's around strategy. And the third one, social learning platforms. As I said before, how do we hyper-accelerate the ability to share, reflect and abstract, which is the adult learning cycle in full swing. So we've got the great conditions to be able to support that right at the moment. And the last one is about reinforcing performance links. So the key catchphrase underneath that is that we intensify our effort when it matters. So self-directed learning theory from Boyatzis is a guy who's been around for a long time, says that we learn when it matters, whether it's a new job, whether it's having to get up here and talk about something in particular, whether it's a new project. As adults and adult learners, we learn when it matters and when we're going to be held to account, whether that's formal accountability mechanisms around how we're going to be measured, or whether it's our behaviour in social context. So it's a really, I think, critical thing. And Sengi, his language is much plainer than mine. He'll sort of frame that, all leadership development that he sees is baloney. He said it's not about the work of work, and it's not performance linked. So here we're saying we need to be really clear about how we design learning and change interventions to really closely align with the things that matter. Down the bottom there, you see that quote, less than 20% say that their human resource functions and business units co-own learning, a practice that reinforces the importance of skill development and also aligns learning objectives with business needs. So, how does that happen? Well, the first practice there, which we talk about there, is how do we co-own change, that we've got specialists in the centre, for example, around change or OD or learning, that are helping to design excellent learning interventions closely with the business, who know what matters because they see the customer, they know what matters today and tomorrow, and they know what's needed. Define a theory of change. So what would you like the outcomes to be, and what would you like to see, and how do we almost start with the end in mind, so that we're designing interventions to hit those points? And I think it's a really good one, and I think it was from a previous piece of work and methodology that Justina designed on evaluation of learning effectiveness. And it's how do we start to think about evidence and not proof? It's really hard to evaluate programs of work that really just look at sales impact, for example, or growth or customer satisfaction, because we know they're influenced by so many different things. But how do we work back from that and define the evidence points of good learning or good change, so that we can then start to hold accountability metrics or conversations that centre around those? And there are practical things that we've done for a long time that we need to keep doing, 360-degree or 180-degree culture change monitors, so we're continually tracking what behaviour change looks like, helping people reflect on that and embedding that from an accountability perspective. So I guess there are three things that we're saying that they're always present in systemic or organisations that are changing for the better and are changing at scale. But I guess if I go back a couple of slides, it's sort of saying, actually, it makes sense if you think about those three things. Number one is leaders and people who are able to have good, constructive dialogue. Number two is that change happens within groups, and when people come together and socialise, it's when people construct and deconstruct a new reality, deconstruct and construct a new reality. And when it's performance links and it matters to our jobs and our customers and people, people take more notice of it. So it's the coming together of those three things that we're really trying to fuse with a level of discipline into the programs that we're developing, whether it's around change, culture, or capability. So I think we've talked quite a lot now. What I'd like to do is we're going to get you to almost reintroduce yourself to your groups, and we've got an activity for you. If I just go forward. Okay, so what we'd like you to do is reflect on a recent organisational change. You might find that there are a couple within your group, so you might want to reflect on a couple, or you might just want to pick one, but maybe spend the first couple of minutes talking about the things that are going on. And really reflect on the key principles that we've shared here today. Which workforce segments did you invest in to support this change? Did the investment pay off? Why or why not? So we'd like you to have a little bit of a conversation about that and share your experiences together. And then we'd like you to reflect on, would your investment plan look any different when you've considered some of the things we've shared up here today? Do you think you got it right from your own experience? Do you think there's things that you'd tweak? So we're going to give you probably a good 20 minutes or so to have a conversation. We'll come back, hear how you went, and we'll share a few of your stories with each other from the front.